Thank you. So thanks everyone for having us over here. As Ashish pointed, so I'll be talking about high performance networks. I'm Ashrut Ambastha. I'm basically a staff architect at Mellanox. Mellanox is, I don't know whether you know about it, but Mellanox is an Israeli company which basically makes high performance, low latency networks for supercomputers. So again, I don't have anything Mellanox specific over here apart from the logo that you see on the slides because I never changed my slides. My main agenda today would be to kind of connect the dots between what we study in school and college and how that maps onto a real supercomputing system. So I'm going to be talking a little bit of electrical engineering to start with. I don't know if most of the people over here are with CSE background. You would have taken some course on electrical engineering as well, some EE course. So you might relate to it, but I'll try to make it simple. At the same time, we can have some amount of interaction. If you want me to go deeper into a certain aspect or subject, I'll be happy to do so. So with that introduction, let's start. First of all, what do you all know about networks? I mean, of course, you use all the gigabit networks and all the hostels and all the departments. At the end of the day, it's some cable that is coming out of a computer going into a switching system and lots of computers connected to that, right? And you're able to do data transfer by opening maybe a sockets interface and then doing a TCP or a UDP or any data transfer over it, right? How does that differ from a high-performance network, or how does it differ from a supercomputer's network? Okay, so I will spend few minutes on the evolution of networks for HPC. First of all, the networks are everywhere. I mean, there are networks in your mobile. There are networks in big cloud data centers. There are networks in HPC systems. So I'm mostly concentrating on networks which are required for HPC, AI, machine learning kind of clusters because the requirements from network for these kind of workloads is similar. Okay. Eventually, what does the network do? It links up multiple compute elements, multiple storage elements, multiple memory elements, right? When people started making large computers, if the problem did not fit on a single processor, you require multiple processors, and now you need to interlink it together. So initially, SMP, can anyone tell me what SMP stands for? Exactly. So SMP machines were basically used when there was cache coherency desired. People started linking multiple processors together with some network processor or something which is part of the CPU itself and made a system. Okay. Now, there was a limit to which how large a system could be made using the SMP architecture. The limits were both related to the electrical domain, as in physically how much you can link in what space, and also with memory domain, how much cache coherency can you do, how much page locks you can do, and things like that. And basically, industry started moving towards cluster. Clusters are nothing but, it doesn't have a coherent memory, but it does constitute of multiple, you have clusters here in your department, it does constitute of multiple processor linked with a high performance fabric which does message passing, right? So my talk over here will be focused mainly towards interconnects for clusters. Then I'm going to start with basics of bandwidth and latency and what practical values we started off with, where we are today, what can we do to improve these to go towards an exascale architecture, and what are the challenges in achieving those numbers. Okay, I'll talk about those. So before that, let me give a brief history of, since it's a network talk, I'm going to give you a brief history of how networks evolved. And these are purely high-performance computing networks. It all started off in the mid-90s with Cray introducing their crossbar switch, which allowed multiple processors to connect into an SMP box. Okay? And in the late 90s, or I would say early 2000s, is where multiple low-latency, high-performance interconnects started shaping up. It was basically Quadrix as a company which brought in QSNet. There was a company called Myricom which brought in a standard called Myrinet. And then there was InfiniBand. I should not be lighting Mellanox here because it wasn't started by Mellanox. InfiniBand was a consortium. You use IB, right? You use IB in your cluster. So InfiniBand actually was a consortium of industry leaders who wanted to make a open standards, high performance interconnect right down from PHY layer. Okay, so no commonality between InfiniBand and Ethernet even in the PHY, and definitely a much improved transport. It does not follow an exact 7-layer OSI model, but something close to that, mainly used for in-data center networking. So that started around in 1999. Mellanox, as in we were the first ones to bring in a silicon which implemented the InfiniBand protocol for the switch, for the host channel adapter that you call an SCA, as well as the target channel adapter, which is for storage. So that started off with something called SDR. And I'm going to talk about speeds and feeds because that is one of the primary things how networks have evolved. SDR kind of stood for single data rate. It's just names basically over there. Then DDR was dual data rate. SDR basically meant you are doing 10 Gbps bandwidth point to point between any pair of compute server. And how that 10 Gbps was developed and how it evolved, I will talk about that in the coming slides. DDR doubled it, went to dual data rate, which is 20 Gbps. QDR was quad data rate. Then we went into 14 data rate. FDR, EDR is 100 Gbps. And current generation that that InfiniBand is running is HDR, which is 200 Gbps to a single server. And I will talk about what is the relevance of this Gbps into a parallel program that you would run on a cluster. In parallel, Quadrix started off with 10, went to 20, went to 40. Myricom did the same. Then there was something called InfiniPath, which was taken. They also implemented InfiniBand standards, by the way. It was taken over by QLogic, and QLogic called it TrueScale. Then it was acquired by Intel, which is what you may be aware of, you see as Omnipath interconnect. And all of that kind of, they've all stopped. Right now, the continuing standards are the Cray ones. Cray moved over to C-Star with the Dragonfly architecture, then Gemini and Aries interconnect. And right now, they call their interconnect something called Slingshot, which is 100 to 200 Gbps. So this is kind of the evolution of proprietary interconnects other than Ethernet for high performance computing. And most of them are proprietary. Generally, that's why the important thing is, it's the open standard defined interconnect which always keeps on going. As you see, not just interconnect, for everything. When you look at compute, you look at parallel programming models, whatever is out there and open standards, that continues. Most of the proprietary ones, either they morph into a new proprietary one or they die down. So the reason I have that InfiniBand as a blue line all to all is because that has been a technology which has actually completely remained open standard, and it is fully, because it is open, it's fully forwards and backwards compatible. So you can connect a HDR system to just like Ethernet. Like you take a 10 gigabit Ethernet or a 40 gigabit Ethernet, if you change the media, as in change the connectors, you will be able to downgrade it to 10, even 1. And all the upper layer protocols, as long as the PHY is downgraded, all the upper layer protocols are consistent, right? If you're doing a TCP transfer over 10 gigabit Ethernet, the same thing works over 1 gigabit Ethernet as well. So similarly in InfiniBand, it's the same set of drivers. Obviously it changes. You must have heard of, you're aware of OFIT drivers, right? Open Fabric driver for interconnect. So they are the drivers which are used for defining the communication libraries. It's all there. It's all present in your cluster as well. I think it's just at a lower level, so you don't have to, the sysadmins will have to go into it, but as a programmer or as a user, you might not need to. But I'll talk about some of the tweaks there which can, which can affect performance and so on and so forth. So before I go into details of networks and topologies and how do you make large supercomputers, I just want to spend we've got a lot of time, so I just wanted to spend 10 minutes on the fundamentals of why clusters, why SMP was not possible. There are a lot of physics-related and practical limitations, and that is what I wanted to cover. So when I say, I'll take InfiniBand as an example. The same thing follows for most of the other interconnects as well. Most of the interconnect, let's say you cut a RJ45 cable, which is there in your normal LAN, you will see multiple wires in it, right? There are maybe 4 pairs of wires. They all are differential pairs, which are basically transmitting electrical signals as a series of zeros and ones. Okay? Now there are analog portions in your interconnect chip which drives this. Okay? Which will drive it, and then there will be a receiver side which will try to receive it and try to make sense out of it. And the media is that RJ45 copper cable. There are optical cables as well and things like that. I'll come to why all those things are needed. Similarly, in high-performance networks, for example, InfiniBand, if you cut an InfiniBand cable, you will see differential pairs inside. There will be 4 lanes of copper wires running. Okay? Every lane runs signals at 2.5 gigahertz for a 10 Gbps system. If you have 4 lanes, it gives you 2.5 times 4, 10 Gbps. Okay? When you are, so before I go there, let me lighten this up. Actually, since everybody's had lunch and will be feeling sleepy, but this is a very important thing. So always things are driven by standards. Everybody wants to define standards, right? And always the standards are competing because a certain company has done their R&D in a certain kind of technology and they want that to be proliferated because they will get an advantage. Whereas the competitor company will have something different. So there have always been, there are, 14 standards. Now everybody says, everybody twice a year gets together and says, hey, this is ridiculous. We got to have something common so that we can, interoperate and we can develop. And the result of that meeting always is the new standard. And that is the 15 standard, right? So it's very difficult to kind of standardize on the low-level phi things. There are certain standards there, but these are the IPs and the USPs which basically define the company's position in a competitive capitalistic market. Okay? So everybody wants to do their own thing, but at the end of the day, it is all standard physics. Okay? So let's say you started off with that 1 gigabit interconnect and you want to increase the speeds and feeds. How can you do it? Number one, if you look at the, this thing works. Even this thing works, so I can do. So if you look at the y-axis here, that defines the bandwidth at which a particular differential pair, a lane, is operating. Like the wire, what is the fundamental frequency of clock going onto that wire? Right now, with SDR InfiniBand, it was 2.5 gigahertz. Right now, we are at HDR InfiniBand, or most of the people with 100 gigabit network are doing it at 25 gigahertz. Okay? You can increase it. You can take it to 50 gigahertz. Okay, and believe me, this is equivalent to, if you run transmission line theory, this is equivalent to running microwaves on a standard PCB. If you have a chip which is connected to a connector in which you will have a wire going into the next computer, there will be, everything is designed as transmission lines over here because this is pure, you're going into the microwave domain. So it's difficult to increase this beyond a certain level, but there are, that's what people said at 10 Gbps. Right now we are at 25. The other way of doing it is you have multiple lanes going in. So usually in a standard Ethernet, you are defining 4 lanes. Okay? So every lane is running at 25G. 4 lanes are going to give you 100G. In a standard 1 gigabit, every lane runs at 250 Mbps, and you will have 4 lanes giving you 1 Gbps. Okay? You can increase more number of lanes, but then that basically means that the number of differential lines that you want per port from your switching silicon increases in a geometric manner, right? If you double the number of, let's say if you've got a chip which is capable of connecting 10 servers, that means it has got 10 ports. Every port will have 4 lanes, 4 for TX, 4 for RX. You want to increase the bandwidth. If you double the lane, the number of state machines that you need to have there, the number of silicon area that you need to have there, and more importantly, the packet size from which you can take out those many electrical signals. That is also a physical constraint. You cannot make a chip which is this big, because then the yield goes down dramatically. So you cannot, then the yield goes to less than 50%. Like if you take a 12-inch wafer and make those chips, 50% of them are a waste. So there is a certain, there is a peak, there's a maxima in which the yield is maximum, and everybody designs in that range. And then when the process shrinks, you can design better, right? So you cannot, again, I'm telling you about the challenges. You cannot keep increasing the number of lanes. What else can you do? Well, you can change the modulation scheme. NRZ stands for non-return to zero. That means it's either 1 or a 0. So 1 corresponds to, let's say, 1 volt on the line, 0 corresponds to 0 volt. It's usually differential signal, so we swing from minus 0.5 to plus 0.5. Okay? What if I was able to encode more? So that's where pulse amplitude modulation comes into play, right? You must have, these are basics you would have learned definitely. So what do? You have multiple levels in your amplitude, and therefore you can now, if you have 4 levels, you can encode 2 bits in every transition. But what is the problem in that? The problem is, now you need to have a receiver which is able to distinguish between these levels within the swing. You cannot have an infinite swing because your transistors are not going to drive very high voltage. So within the same swing, you need to distinguish between multiple levels. I'm going to talk about that. This diagram that you see, is anyone familiar with something called an eye diagram? Okay, so that's good. So I'll talk a bit about eye diagram. That's the basic of doing the fundamentals of transmitting data in a link. Okay? So yeah, one more way is to do amplitude modulation. Another way to reduce the number of lanes, but still have more number of lanes, is by doing multiplexing in the wavelength domain. You do WDM, right? You modulate your electrical signals into multiple optical signals of different wavelengths, and then you multiplex it and drive it over a single fiber. That's also a way of increasing your gigabits or terabits per second. So I'm going to talk about all these things, but before that, let's go into the fundamentals. Eventually, I mean, at the end of the day, what are we doing? What we're doing is, right now, forget switches, okay? Just consider your parallel computer is just a set of 2 servers which are connected to each other using a back-to-back link, okay? You will have a transmitter, you will have a receiver side, that means, and vice versa, right? So on the analog side, it basically corresponds to some amount of channel. If you open up a computer, you will have a PCB over there, there will be a connector, and the Ethernet chip will be somewhere away from the connector. There will be some transmission lines, which is your PCB traces, going from this chip to the connector. In the connector, you will plug in a wire, standard patch cord. You will plug the other end of the wire to the other side, and that is nothing but your channel. And the other side, it will connect to a receiver. Receiver will try to make sense out of it, whatever data is coming, right? So what is the eye diagram? The eye diagram is the fundamentals of quality of signal that is flowing through. And why am I talking about quality? Because I want to tell you the limitations which define our current generation interconnect systems. And how do those limitations come into being? Okay? When you're transmitting data, it's nothing but a series of zeros and ones at the end of the day on the file layer. It looks something like that. If you see over there, you have multiple, this became a 1, then a 0, then again a 1, then a 0, then, okay, this is your fundamental 1, 0, 1, 0. These are basically 2 1s and 2 zeros. Then this is again 1, multiple amount of zeros, then again multiple amount of 1s, and so on and so forth. Now, when you do, so you basically recover the zeros and 1s using something called clock data recovery. Basically, you slice this, this overall signal, and then you say, okay, there are so many zeros and ones. So the eye diagram is nothing but a superposition of every transition, and not transition. The transition, for example, here the transition did not happen. So you will get continuous amount of straight lines. Then as soon as when the transition happened, you will get a up going like this, and over here like that, right? So if you superimpose all your multiple zeros and ones, your output looks something like an eye. Well, this one doesn't look very much like an eye. It's a simulated one, but this one does. So this is how the signal, the electrical signal that is coming out of your wires, it looks like, okay? And its basic characteristics are, what is the rise time, fall time, the zero crossing, and it all depends on how the signal is traversing through the channel. Now, your receiver will be able to make sense out of the data if this eye is open. What it means is the distortion was there, but it wasn't so much that you did not get any open period. Basically, this is your bit period. Okay? All the distortion that is happening here, that is kind of closing the eye. What it means is that zeros can be mistaken for a 1 and 1 can be mistaken for a 0, and that's where you have to go into a higher level of error correction. Hamming codes we all do, right? So when you have multiple series of zeros and ones, then you encode 4 useful bit of data into a 6-bit data and you try to take out the actual data. I'm not even going there right now. Right now I'm trying to do the phi level. In the phi level, I need to have an open eye. If the eye is not open, basically my receiver will not be able to make any sense out of what it got. Okay? Eye starts closing. Why does it close? It's pretty simple. Every channel or every wire or every trace through which you are transmitting data has got a frequency dependent characteristics of insertion loss, right? In standard electronics, if you take a wire and you try to drive it from here to there, the resistance is nothing but the loss faced, right? In these kind of signals, basically the insertion loss comes in due to many effects. I don't know, so you talked about, you must have studied skin effect, right? Skin effect of conductors, wherein current tries to go only on the outer surface of the conductor and it will not take the entire bulk and so on and so forth. If you take a transmission line, then depending on how fast its dielectric can polarize and the zeros and ones are basically electromagnetic wave, right? Now, they are traveling through the medium where you have a particular dielectric. That dielectric is nothing but in the PCB or PCB material. Okay? In UTP cable, that dielectric is nothing but the twisted pair is there. The dielectric is nothing but the plastic between it, basically, or air as a dielectric is also there. So that dielectric, when signal is going, it cannot polarize and depolarize fast enough. That is also frequency dependent. So what happens is when you have a series of 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, like continuous alternating zeros and 1, what is the spectrum of that? That spectrum will be the clock frequency, right? And if you have a series of multiple zeros followed by multiple 1, let's say 2 zeros and 2 1, the fundamental frequency of that will be half of the clock frequency, right? So you have multiple frequency components when you're transmitting that data, correct? And now those frequency components, they get attenuated. On the x-axis is increasing frequency. Okay? Now, what this graph shows is your channel, your interconnect, it has frequency dependent component. High frequency will get attenuated more, low frequency will get attenuated less. So now going back to the eye diagram, when you have series of zeros and ones, okay, their attenuation will be more and the eye becomes closed. When you have standard large set of zeros and ones, it's pretty much open. So how fast can you transmit depends on many, many factors. One of the factors is how long can you transmit, because that is insertion loss. Other factor is how good your dielectric material is to cater to the polarization and depolarization, right? So all these things that we study in our standard, these are 12 standard physics, and then these are in electrodynamics, electromagnetics, we do the same things, right? So all these things actually affect in designing an interconnect system. And these are the things which define the limits of what is available today and what we need to do to break these limits and go faster. Okay? I talked about this. I don't want to go too much into details. Let me talk about one more thing. There's something called return loss. So now, how do I map it to what we study? Let's, maximum power transfer theorem, right? You must have read that. Like when the source impedance is equal to the load impedance, maximum power is transferred. When there is an impedance mismatch, power is reflected back, correct? Okay, again, basic EE 101. Same thing happens in your channel. When you are doing an interconnect between two computers, its impedance is not consistent throughout. Why? Because it is not a homogeneous transmission line from the source to destination. You've got that plastic connector. The plastic connector's got certain gap between its pins, and similarly you've got the PCB, which is the traces which are going through multiple layers in your routing and so on and so forth. So it is not a homogeneous transmission line. It has impedance mismatches. Because it has impedance mismatches, if you do a time domain reflectometry, if you do a TDR to find out, just launch a wave and then get the reflected wave, you will actually see what are the impedance variations inside your channel. A standard transmission line is basically impedance is given by that equation. Again, this one is first year, second year electromagnetics. It's dependent on j omega L by j omega C, where L is your inductive nature and C is the capacitive nature. Now, because of this, because inductance and capacitances over your channel differ, you will have reflection as well. So whatever your chip is launching into that wire does not fully get to the destination. How homogeneous your design is, signal quality depends on that. So all these things basically define how long can you go. That's where we come to optics. Okay? Because copper has got a certain amount of insertion loss, and you cannot go too long. If you want to design a big supercomputer which has got, let's say, 5,000 servers, obviously 5,000 servers will not fit in just this much amount of space. It will take maybe the whole room, so, or maybe even more than that. So a connection from server over here to server over there will require maybe a 30-meter cable. Copper 30-meter cable will never be able to do that transmission. Your eye is always closed, no matter what you do. Unless you start having receivers which are complicated digital filters which will do some amount of correlation and try to take out the signal from the noise floor. But for doing that, you will be paying huge latency penalties. So we don't do that. Okay? What we do is move into optical domain. So now, as soon as from the chip my signal has come out, I try to convert it into optical signal as soon as possible. And that's where these transceivers come into play. You must have seen in your data center, there are multiple optical transceivers, right? For even 1 gigabit Ethernet or 10 gigabit Ethernet. These transceivers do simple thing of converting electrical to optical domain. How do they do it? They're nothing but standard VCSEL diodes, the vertical cavity surface emitting lasers. Basically, you can even call it an LED, okay? Take an LED, give it a square wave, it will turn on and off, correct? And now, if you launch this on and off light of that LED through a optical medium and then have a photodiode on the other end, which will respond to that LED turning on and off, you will have data received on the other end. And the attenuation of light in a waveguide, in an optical fiber, is much, much, much lower than what you get in copper. So you can do long distances. Okay? Now, where does the limitation start coming in on the optical side? The limitations start coming in, and this is, again, first things of quantum mechanics. So when you're doing, when does the light come? When you're doing this electron-hole recombination and then there's a photon released, right? So light comes out. How fast can you do this, on and off, like recombination and then separation, depends on how fast in your silicon you can combine this. Like how fast, what is the lifetime of your carriers there, and how fast you can emit a photon and then stop, then again emit photons and then stop. That will define how fast can you transmit zeros and ones. Okay? That also has a limit. Fortunately for us, that limit is quite high. We can actually turn on and off a laser at 50 gigahertz. Okay? So I can transmit in a single lane 50 Gbps without worrying about what to do. Then you'll ask, okay, what beyond that? Okay, after 50, if that's a limitation, what do I do after that? Okay? That's where photonics comes in. So now, I don't turn a laser on and off. What do I do is, I have a nice stable Fabry-Perot laser which is driving a waveguide in silicon. So if you take a silicon device and construct a waveguide on it using MEMS technology, you can actually drive infrared laser through that. And let's say in that waveguide, now I plate both of the sides. Again, it's all at micro scale. I plate both the sides with some amount of aluminum and provide some electric field to it. Okay? Now when the photons moving through the waveguide, because of me applying electric field, it will deviate. Okay? It will deviate and I can modulate the photon. And this modulation can happen at much, much higher speeds. I'm not turning a laser on and off now. This is equivalent to, if you did your transistor experiments, there was something called, you do transistor as a switch, you turn it on and off, and then you use transistor as an amplifier where you operate it in the active region, right? This is something equivalent to you operating that in an active region. I don't turn it on and off, I just modulate in the active region where you have huge amount of gains, okay? So that's where I can actually transmit much, much higher bandwidth. That's where we are going. When I talk about terabits per second kind of bandwidth of interconnect, you need these kind of technologies. Companies in their research labs are also making PCBs which have waveguides as optical waveguides as their traces, because you cannot transmit over standard copper in a very high speed. So what you do is you take a chip, you flip chip bond it, and the chip itself has a laser diode which emits light into a polymer waveguide which is part of your PCB. That's how you transmit high speed within system as well as outside of the system using these transceivers. So these are the 5 things. I hope I was clear in these things. I tried to map what we study versus what are the challenges and what we can do to kind of circumvent those challenges. Let's move to actual systems now. So when we make very large systems, they're actually pretty large. If you look at the latest top 500 list of supercomputers, the largest system, I've not taken the top one, even top 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all of them are 30,000, 40,000 servers in a single layer 2 architecture. Now let me start moving towards transport layer, right? I talked about the 5. Let's move to the transport side of things. So these are very large clusters, like the one at Texas Advanced Computing, it's around 23 petaflops with 8,000 nodes or 8,000 servers in a single network. Then all these I've just put because these are 200 Gbps. There are certain Chinese systems which are listed and non-listed, which uses some of the technologies from us as well. They are 40,000 servers, 40,000 servers in a single architecture working as a single computer. Okay? So somehow now we need to make this system. I just talked about how we connect 2 servers back to back, right? What about larger systems? So let's get into that. By the way, since I saw that there are a lot of people talking about AI and machine learning and deep learning over here. So actually, the requirements for network for AI or ML kind of a system is the same as a standard HPC system, almost same. So the largest HPC systems are also one of the fastest AI systems if they have GPUs in them, because GPUs are mostly used for doing your, running TensorFlow or whatever framework of AI that you guys are running. Okay? Facebook, Sony, these are all public. There are lots of confidential systems as well, which I can't name, but these are all public systems. They are as big as, few thousand nodes of GPUs. So there are, 4,000 or 5,000 GPUs connected together to form a single cluster. And this interconnect, again, is dependent on what all I talked about. So some of the most of the interconnects right now ride on InfiniBand. Again, open standards, that's the reason. So let me get into those. I talked about phi, I talked about bandwidth. We talked about 10 Gbps to 40 Gbps to 100 Gbps and 200, that HDR. The other important factor the basic important factor in a network is latency. Okay? When you take a copper cable, you actually add around, you will have around 5 nanoseconds on the phi per meter. And this is a hard limit. Can anyone tell me why this is the hard limit? It's not, physics-wise, it's not possible to go below this. That's the speed of light. So light takes around, every meter, it takes around 3 point something nanoseconds, but you get around 5 nanoseconds because this is not speed of light in vacuum, this is speed of light in that transmission line media, which will obviously get divided by the relative permittivity of my medium, right? So in optics, it is nothing but the refractive index. So if you take glass, if you're driving the laser through your glass optical fiber, speed of light gets divided by 1.5. So that's how fast light can travel in that media. That results into around 4 to 5 nanoseconds per meter. So if you make a large cluster and if you have one server here and obviously everything is connected, if you have a 50-meter cable between them, 250 nanoseconds is the hard limit. You cannot do anything about it, right? There's nothing that can be done. Optical cable also, you get around 5 nanoseconds per meter, but now you need to add a little bit for that electro-optical conversion. And depending on the speed, you need to add some more for reception. Like when you have received your data on the PIN diode, that is the receiver side, you need to have some sort of filter or an equalizer. Okay, on the phi, we saw that different frequency got attenuated differently, right? So what you need to do is, on the receiver side, you need to run a filter which will boost the higher frequency, just like your graphic equalizer in your sound system. Nowadays, nobody uses it, but the old ones used to have those knobs, right? And then you could increase the bass, you could increase the treble, and so on. Similarly, you have over here a graphic equalizer kind of a setup in your receiver. And there, you run complicated digital filters, the FIR and IIR filters that we study. And those digital filters add more latency because it is a sliding window thing, right? And that latency goes into the range of 100 nanoseconds or so. Now, if you have an analog optical filter, you can reduce it, okay? So that's again one limitation. Then, you cannot connect every server to every other server by having point-to-point connectivity, because if you have, let's say, 500 servers, you cannot have 500 ports coming out of one server, right? You cannot have 499 ports coming out of a server. So you need a switch. Okay? You need a switch to which you will link up all these computers. That switch will again have port-to-port latency because at the end of the day, data will come into the switch. There will be some lookup done based on the headers, and that lookup will go through some state machines. It will take some time. Right now, the industry does it at around 90 nanoseconds. Okay? So between data coming in from port number 1 and all the decisions being made inside and coming out of port number 2, the worst case latency is 90 nanoseconds right now. There are bigger switches because you cannot just make, if you have, okay, right now I'm showing a 40-port switch. It's a switch with 40 ports. Connect 40 servers, you're done. What about more than that? I showed you 10,000 node cluster, right? So there are bigger switches. Bigger switches, I'll go into the topologies. My next discussion point is topologies. Bigger switches have higher latency. Why? I will talk about that. Then there are, if you look at 2 servers connected back to back, their latency is of the order of around 600 nanoseconds, okay, which encompasses all these latencies. This is the application level latency, as in when you do a MPI send receive or when you do an MPI latency test, you will get, 600 to 700 nanoseconds. That's actually, sorry, MPI you'll get 800. This is verbs level, that is a lower level than MPI. MPI adds some more amount of software overheads, which adds those 200 nanoseconds, so you get around 800 nanoseconds. So these are the kind of point-to-point latencies that we are looking at in today's generation supercomputers. I think the cluster that you have here, is it, do you know if it is based on I know it's based on InfiniBand. Is it EDR or FDR? Do you know? Okay. So it would be somewhere around this, around 800 to 1200 nanoseconds kind of latencies. Okay. Now, the thing is, yeah, please. These are all electrical switches. There are the switches which will do optical switchings are still in the R&D stage, wherein you will have switching done in waveguides on a structure inside the silicon that are nothing is production yet. So the fastest switch, actually these are the fastest switch I will talk about right now available today, which is a backplane bandwidth of around 12 terabits per second in a single silicon. They all perform electrical switching. It's only for connecting between switch to switch you do the electro-optical conversion so that you can actually make a large cluster. Otherwise, there is no way that you can, as I explained, there is no way that you can do a 10-meter copper cable from switch A to switch B and let it run at 100 Gbps. It will never transmit. Okay? Sorry? The transmission line losses, right? So, yeah, there are multiple losses. One, I talked about the insertion loss, which was insertion loss is the loss of the media, okay, which is when you have added a copper cable, basically it will attenuate your frequencies, right? It will not, if you ran something from here to Lucknow, for example, the voltage that you drove over here will not be available over there. Okay, so that is the insertion loss because you're going to attenuate. And that's why I said you cannot drive longer distances. That actually limited why, you could not, apart from other things, why you could not make a very large SMP. That's why you had to move into, message passing interface where you make a fabric, a switched fabric, right? So these all losses, I was coming to this. So I talked about point-to-point latency. It is a certain number. Now, there are latencies and performance hits at various levels. I just talked about right now the 5 nanosecond and the 20 and the 90 nanoseconds. Those are at the electrical phi level. Beyond that, you have a lot of things on the logical side of things. For example, transport. I will come into the transport side of things now. How do you transmit data from one computer to the other? Not in a physical layer, but as a logical thing. How are you aware of, how do you transmit right now? You open sockets, right? When you have to have a TCP sockets connection. It's a Berkeley compliant socket that you will open. You will do some buffer writing into that socket, and then the lower level of, lower layers will ensure that those will get converted into MTUs, it will go to the destination and it will be received by your destination application, right? So it's a certain mechanism of doing it. It has its flaws, it has its shortcomings, and that is what is addressed by the technologies which is used in HPC system. And one of the key technology is RDMA. Is everyone aware of RDMA or remote direct memory access? Okay, so let me spend 5 minutes on this. You know DMA, right? DMA operation, direct memory access. So if you have a computer, you've got some memory, you've got an IO device. The IO device could be memory mapped, and you can do a DMA operation. Your CPU, you can give a pointer and say, I want to read this IO device is memory mapped in this particular range, and I want to do a read from this memory location to that memory location. I'll give a starting pointer, I'll give a length of the pointer, and the CPU will be able to do a DMA operation, read all the data and pass it on, or maybe read it into its own register for processing, right? That happens within a computer. That's a standard DMA. RDMA means remote direct memory access. What it means is, I'm actually doing a DMA operation on a computer which is not me, which is the other computer in my cluster. So I'm going to, source computer is going to read from a destination computer's target memory, doing a DMA operation without going through the multiple buffer copies of a sockets interface. Okay? In TCP, what happens? Your application your application has got a certain buffer allocated to it. Okay? When you want to transmit the data of that buffer, you will copy that data into the sockets buffer, which is again part of your system memory. That will go into the transport protocol driver, basically the buffer which is seen by the network card. Network card is also PCI mapped, right? You will see, if you do an LSPCI, you will see which PCI bus that card rides into and what all memory location that card can access. So it's the sockets layer which basically copies the data into the memory which is addressable by the NIC card. And then the NIC card takes it and then breaks it into MTU, takes it into the NIC driver and then breaks it into MTU, transfers it to the destination. Same process is repeated all the way till your destination application gets the data. Do you know what is the latency for this whole thing? Right now we talked about 600 nanoseconds, 800 nanoseconds, right? This entire process takes more than 10 microseconds. So that's why I'm saying it's not just, electrical engineering wise, we are developing stuff, reducing the latencies, but there is tons of latencies on the other stack, okay, which needs to be reduced. And it has been reduced. It has been reduced since last 20 years. RDMA was one of the pioneering technologies to reduce that transport layer latency, because now my NIC card is able, the network interface card that I have in my server, which is RDMA capable, okay, it is able to address the entire system memory. So if my application says I want to do a transfer of data, maybe a matrix which lies in my buffer from this location to that location, if I have to do that transfer, NIC card, it just rings a doorbell to the NIC card saying, my application, I want to transfer data from this memory location to that memory location to that particular server, some random faraway server. And the NIC card can actually do a read operation from system memory directly and do a put operation to the destination computer system memory directly. No need for all this kernel TCP/IP stack. And the moment you're able to do this in hardware, you bring down the latency from that 10 microsecond to less than 1 microsecond. That 800 microsecond that I showed you is actually a message transfer latency. So you can try it. Just go to your rooms, or maybe just do a netperf latency test between you and your neighbor's computer. Okay? You will see more than, in a 1 gigabit network, you will see 20 to 30 microseconds. Okay? You do a RDMA ping pong test on your cluster over here, you will see less than 1 microsecond. So this is one of the pioneering technologies which is present in all high performance network, which is the differentiating technology between high performance network and standard Ethernet, which we are used to using. Okay? And I will contradict myself as I go along, because now we can do RDMA over Ethernet as well. I'll talk about it. Okay? But the concept is DMA operation across network. Okay? And now comes the complication of maintaining this over a fabric. But when I say fabric, I mean interconnect and the topology. So I'm going to talk about topologies. But before I go there, I will talk about another, I don't know, there was one CUDA programming session and all. Did somebody cover GPU RDMA? No, right? Okay, let me talk a bit about GPU RDMA as well. So when you're doing CUDA programming, you are doing parallel programming inside your system which has got multiple GPUs. That's fine. When you want to scale, or when you have data sets which are, or when you want to do faster training, you might now want to move into a GPU cluster. GPU cluster is a cluster of multiple GPUs, as the name suggests. So you will have a server with 4 GPUs, another server with 4 GPUs, like that, tens of servers with GPUs. Now, you have a parallel job which spans across this entire gamut of GPUs, not just within the GPU. Within the GPU, you can define with CUDA libraries your processes and number of threads and how much will run on what and so on and so forth. In a cluster also you use the same CUDA library, but now your job is distributed across all these servers. When the job is distributed across all these servers, you have to transfer messages. How will you transmit data from the GDDR memory of your GPU to the GDDR memory of the other GPU? It has to go through the network, right? If you want to take it through the network, if you take it through standard TCP network, you will again hit these penalties. Okay? So now you need to do a DMA operation. So here, if you look at it, you've got a CPU, okay, which is your x86 processor, on which a GPU is connected through some chipset. Okay? And in the GPU, if you have a GPU memory, CPU, you have your standard system RAM. Okay? This GPU is connected. How do you connect the GPU in a server? It is connected on a PCI slot. Right? There's a GPU card which is connected on a PCI slot. If it is on a PCI slot, it is again memory mapped to some location on the system's memory. Okay? So now, if you want to transmit, okay, in another PCI slot, there is a network card. Network card is also a PCI device that connects to maybe a target server somewhere. Consider a cluster, a GPU cluster of 2 nodes. That will have two servers which has same architecture. And now if you want to transmit, you want to share. When do you want to share? Okay, let's get to the basics here. You are solving a very large partial differential equation which reduces to matrix vector multiplication at the end of the day. Okay? Most of them will reduce to a sparse matrix vector multiplication. If it's a big equation, your matrix will be very big. You will not be able to fit it into a particular system. That's where you use a cluster, right? You break down the matrix into multiple submatrices and distribute it amongst multiple computers. Everyone will solve its own part and then do a data exchange. Okay? And then it will do another solve and do a data exchange. Why does the data exchange happens? Because you're solving those equations using some iterative method. Maybe Newton-Raphson's or something, but some iterative method where you will always compute and then you will do data exchange. When you do data exchange between multiple systems, you have to go through the network. And the data right now is residing inside the GPU memory. Okay? Now, what all steps I won't say you as a programmer, but what all steps the system does, okay, to transmit that data to the GPU memory of the other GPU. Well, first of all, it has to copy this data into the system memory in which this GPU card is mapped. Okay? Then that data gets copied into the system memory on which the application buffers are mapped. And then basically it will get transmitted through the RDMA, because this card is able to do a DMA from this and it will get transmitted. So we said, okay, why to have these multiple buffer copies? How about developing some lower level libraries and mechanisms in which the NIC card is able to address the same memory space in which the GPU is mapped into. So now all I need to do is do a copy from the GPU memory to the system memory, and the NIC card does a DMA operation. So I save a buffer copy, I save a lot of latencies. You go one step beyond and then you say, why do I even need to copy it into the CPU memory? Why can't I just do a DMA operation from the GPU memory? Well, that's also possible. So how is it possible? Well, there are obviously, there were developments done between various companies and all, where we said, okay, now in a system, rather than going through the system memory, the hardware capable RDMA card should be able to address the GPU memory itself. And now I'm exchanging DMA pointers which are residing in the GPU memory. So I save one more step. Okay? That's one of the fastest way of doing data transfer between GPUs. There is one more thing. So now, even in this mechanism also, basically the application which kind of initiates the transfer is going through the CPU. So the connection establishment, the mechanism of data transfer is first being done through the CPU, and then only the DMA, the data path, fast data path flows through DMA. We went one step forward and said, okay, let's do everything through the GPU. So now even the connection establishment mechanism happens through the GPU itself. Okay? And there is no CPU in the critical data path, and this is one of the fastest methods of GPU communication. So if you're using, and this is what is deployed in all those large machine learning, deep learning AI clusters, which are using mostly NVIDIA GPUs. They're the leaders right now in GPU technology. So you look at the Pascal series or the Volta series, all of them are capable of doing that. InfiniBand hardware, which does hardware RDMA, is capable of doing DMA directly from the GPUs. And all these systems take advantage of these technologies. When you're using a standard Nickel libraries and standard CUDA-based programming, it automatically happens. You don't have to do much. If it is capable of doing GPU RDMA, it will do GPU RDMA. But I just wanted to tell you the nuances of how it goes, what all happens. So with that, I think I have my topology side of, okay, it's slightly long, so we will take a break in 10-15 minutes. Before that, let us do the basics of supercomputing networks. And then after the break, we will talk a little bit of more advanced things on the network side, okay? So let's build some computers. Building block. We started with 2 servers connected back to back, makes a 2-node cluster. I'm very happy, okay? Want to make more? You have to bring in a switch. This is one of the switches. You know, it's an InfiniBand switch. It has got 36 ports of 100 Gbps. It's a full crossbar. What it means is any pair of servers communicating, connected to, let's say, server, there are 36 servers connected. You take random set of 18 sources and random set of 18 destination, and then run to and fro bandwidth benchmark. Everybody will get its own 100 Gbps bandwidth. There is no sharing happening, right? The switch is a full crossbar. When a packet arrives from the source server, and when the switch sees the header contains, in Ethernet you have your source destination MAC and IPs, right? That's how the switch makes a decision of where to send that packet. Similarly, in InfiniBand also there is some packet identifier, there is a routing header, and I will get into why InfiniBand is lower switching than Ethernet because of certain things. But yeah, the switch makes that decision and the data goes through the destination port. So I want to make a 36-node cluster. I just connect every server to this, and I have a 36-node cluster. Okay, all fine. Want to make a bigger one? There are certain switches. You might see, those chassis switches in Ethernet or anything. You'll see a big core router or a core switch which has got 100 ports, 200 ports, right? But those 200 ports are not a single silicon. I'll come to this one first. Let me go into this. So yeah, you have these large director class switches or chassis switches. Fundamentally, it is nothing but multiple of those building blocks connected together inside. Okay? And how you connect them is what you call the network topology. And this is what we're going to talk about. Let me give a simple example. If you're making, in HPC, you want to have something called a non-blocking network. What does non-blocking network mean? Non-blocking network means that when 2 servers are communicating with each other, their communication should not be blocked by any other 2 pair in the same fabric. Okay? Everybody should get its own path, own highway. Because if you have this blocking, you will not effectively get 100 Gbps. If you have a segment sharing that happens twice, you will get 50 Gbps. If some segment is shared 5 times, you'll get 20 Gbps. Okay? So how do you make a non-blocking network? There are multiple ways of doing it. The easiest way is what is called a Clos architecture, which is what you see over here. So you have a series of, we call it as leaf switches, in which servers will be connected. Okay? And then a 36-port building block has 18 ports looking downwards to the server and has 18 ports going up to another layer of switches. Okay? So now, every server connected to these switch has got a individual path. Because there are 18 up and 18 down, you can have, now again it depends on the kind of routing that is used, but theoretically you can have non-blocking communication because the number of ports which are down, the same number of ports are up. Okay? You're not, if you had 25, 30 ports down and 6 ports up, that means you were oversubscribed. You were oversubscribed 5 times. 6 5s are 30, right? So communication worth 30 people are only going over 6 links. Here it is non-blocking. How big a cluster can you make like this? It's simply defined by this equation where K is the radix. This 36 port that I'm talking about is the radix of your switching silicon. So K is the radix of the silicon and N is the number of levels of my architecture. So in this one, you can see my radix is 36 and N is 2. I have 2 levels over here. So the maximum number of ports that I can support in a non-blocking manner is 36 times 36 by 2, which is 18 to the power n minus 1, which is 2 minus 1. It reduces to 36 times 18, which is 648. That is the largest EDR InfiniBand switch that is available out there. Okay? If you increase the radix to 40, which is what we have right now, a 2-level architecture can get you 40 times 20, which is 800 ports. When you want to grow bigger, that's where things start becoming interesting. So right now, this is one of the architectures, but it doesn't mean that I have to connect those switches in that manner. I can connect it in any way. Which is what is network topology. And that's where let me come back to this one. So simplest way of increasing your cluster size will be now, you had one switch, you had 36 servers connected to it, you had a 36 node cluster. Okay? You want to make more now. So okay, what do? I take 2 switches, connect 24 servers to each of them, and connect 12 links between them. Now I get a 48 node cluster. But this 48 node cluster is kind of blocking. Why? Because if all those 24 guys simultaneously wanted to talk to these 24, they have only 12 links to go through. So they don't get 100 Gbps full, right? So they are 2:1 oversubscribed network. Okay? Another way of doing it is I take 3 switches, have 9 links between them, okay, and then I create a topology like this. I make a ring network. Okay. Can I make a 4-ring network? I can, but there are certain problems here. Okay. Most of the high-performance networks are credit-based. Okay. So when you are doing, one fundamental requirement of doing a DMA operation is you cannot afford to lose packets. In Ethernet, you can lose packet, right? I mean, TCP drop packet, chalo retransmission ho jayega. It will be all good, right? In RDMA, if you're trying to do a DMA operation and you lose your packets, then there is a problem, okay? Because once credit has been allocated, it is assumed by the application that that operation will be done. And that is where InfiniBand or any high-performance networking technology is credits-based and it is not allowed to drop packets. And therefore, you cannot arbitrarily connect switches that may form a deadlock situation, which is what is called a credit loop. In Ethernet, you must have, if you're doing some networking course, you must have read of STP, right? Spanning tree protocol. And then how STP avoids loops by disabling, or if there is a loop, STP will disable one of the ports and then basically it will make sure that there is no deadlock happening. Similarly, in high-performance network also, you need to have some mechanisms of breaking that deadlock. So I don't want to go into the details of how it is done and all, but I just wanted to say you cannot arbitrarily connect. Okay? Once you have connected, you need to have a routing mechanism for your entire fabric. So the most common way of doing it is using this class architecture, and the routing mechanism in high-performance network like InfiniBand basically goes and programs the forwarding table of all the switch. It's something called a linear forwarding table where it is destination-based routing. As means there is a memory inside which contains like in Ethernet you have your MAC table, right? So if data is coming in and then it has a match over there, then it says okay which port to go out. Similarly here, data comes in, you have a match in your table, then it will say where it has to go out and so on and so forth. So this routing happens for this particular topology. It doesn't mean that you cannot connect things in a different manner. And this is, these are various, ways that we can make networks. So I talked about fat tree or Clos network. So this was, okay, let's look into this one, right? This was 648. You cannot go beyond 648 because I don't have K which is higher than 36. Well, in today's world, I've got K which is 40 for 200 Gbps. That means my radix is 40. I've got a silicon which has got 40 ports of 200 Gbps. So it can give me 800 ports of 200 Gbps. I showed you clusters which are 10,000, 20,000, 40,000 nodes, right? So how do you make that? The only way to make it is increase this n now. Okay? How do you increase the n? I have one more layer of switching on top. So now you have your servers. These are nothing but servers. I take some switches. I have 18 ports down. This one I'm showing maybe, well, it's HDR. So I'm taking I'm taking 20 ports down, and I'll take 20 ports up. In this one, I'm taking 20 up, but I'm dividing amongst 12. It's a certain architecture. You can have any, basically you can have, I can have this as 20, this as 20, okay? If I've taken 20 down, I will take 20 up. One link will go to each of these switch, and each of this switch will be able to service 20 of these switches, right? Because I will have another 20, this has got 40, but I'll have another 20 which will be going to the next level. So this forms a completely non-blocking Clos architecture, wherein now I can have, in theory, n becomes 3. So this entire thing becomes 40 times 20 times 20, which is 800 times 20, which is 16K. So with a 3-level architecture, I am able to make a 16,000 node cluster in a non-blocking manner. I can go even more, I can make more levels, but at the end of the day, if I keep making more levels, there is a limitation. The limitation is that I will start adding so many hops that I'll start adding so much latencies, and more than latencies, I will add many more things on the transport side and on the software side of things, that problems will not linearly scale. When I say linear scaling, I mean if you are giving a problem to 200 nodes and it is getting solved in an hour, if you give the same problem to 400 nodes, it should get solved in 30 minutes, right? But you don't get those linear scalings. And you don't get those linear scalings because of many, many reasons. I'll tell you a few of the network reasons why you don't get those linear scaling. The 3-level Clos architectures can be simplified by having large chassis switches, which are nothing but a Clos architecture within themselves. They've got 2 levels of switching inside, right? I mean, it's a big system with a lot of silicon, a lot of liquid cooling, because it's generating almost 30 kilowatts of heat in this small device. And then it has multiple front panel ports through which you connect multiple leaf switches, which are part of your rack. If you see a practical supercomputer, you will have a rack full of servers, right? And that rack will have one switch on top. Every server will connect to that switch. This switch will connect to some core switch. Okay? Like that, you will have tons of racks, 30, 40, 50 racks. Everyone will have this switch, and that will connect to a central switch. If you go into your department cluster, you will see this is how it is kind of constructed. Okay?